Last week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Stephan Cizmar, an early stage investor and tech veteran. In our conversation, we spoke about the benefits of working in an early stage startup environment, how he went from management consultant to starting his own company to then joining the early team at Yext, and also how to navigate the post-college job search environment. So without further delay, here's the interview. So thanks again for taking the time to do this interview, Stefan. So
Oh, it's great, Jason. I hope you're having a great afternoon.
yeah,
Thanks
you
for having me
too.
on.
Yeah, great to have you on, and thank you again for taking the time. So let's just jump straight into it. My first question is, what do you do now, and what were some key experiences that led you to where you are today?
Yeah, great
Start
question,
broad.
Jason. Today, my job is I'm an early stage investor, meaning that I invest in venture backable startups, primarily in resource efficiency, supply chain, developer tools, logistics, and Industry 4.0. In entrepreneurs who are just starting out, meaning pre-seed through Series A, effectively. I would say that like along my career journey, even right now, looking back at it, like every step along the way has led me to this point, which might sound somewhat cliche, but a lot of my
Yep.
collective experiences from starting my career in management consulting to going into entrepreneurship after that, to going into a mid-stage tech company, then a growth stage tech company, and then becoming a founder again, have all led to this point. Have contributed to a collective skill set that I have right now that helps me underwrite opportunities. That's the research side I picked up from consulting, as well as basically a deep empathy and understanding of the entrepreneurial journey, which comes directly from my startup experience. And so, I think if you asked me, when I was a senior in college, perhaps if I think that I'd be doing this, or if I could guess what I would be doing at my age at 35 right now, I wouldn't be able to tell you. This would probably be one of the farthest things from my guesses. Um, but each step along the way has cumulatively added to this point, and given me a collective skill set and network that helps benefit me in my day to day.
That's yeah, it's always great to speak to established tech professionals, and seems to be a trend that a lot of people, at least I've spoken to, have had non-linear journeys to get to where they
Mhm.
are today. So let's switch things up and go all the way back to Stefan 1 year out of college.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you didn't back then see yourself where you are today. What did you see yourself as back then, and what was your North Star if you had one at all?
It's funny because coming out of college and entering the job world,
Yeah.
um, I had made the decision to go into management consulting kind of on a limb.
Hmm.
I was actually at a crossroads during my senior year, and I was very close to actually choosing an academic career, partially because my mother and my parents are academic. My mother's an academic. My father also cherished academics and put a lot of pressure on me when I was a teenager. But also at the same time, I had a deep interest in economics and econometrics, and I was considering looking at graduate programs in that point. It was actually an influential mentor of mine who was also an economics professor, who was a former management consultant himself. He was ex-Bain. Um, and he advised me to go into consulting just to start the career, to basically get a sense of what the professional world looked like. But also being that I liked a multitude of interests, or I had a multitude of interests at the time, that I could basically work on multiple projects in a variety
Hmm.
of industries. And so I had gone into that with the assumption that I would either, you know, go to business school after a couple of years and go into academia. Um, and my, I guess, intention 1 year in was that I was going to work really hard to essentially climb the ranks of a large enterprise management consulting firm,
Hmm.
with the hopes of one day kind of getting to that partner level. But things rapidly changed, as my career progressed.
And what exactly changed? So you were at IBM for 3 years.
Yeah, about 3.5, 4 years.
Hmm.
I think starting around my third year, um, I started to get a little bit of the entrepreneurial itch. I was living in DC at the time, and I was
Mhm.
attending tech meetups. I was going to hackathons. I had also gotten progressively more technical when I entered the workforce and when I was working at IBM on the consulting side, the tech consulting side.
Mhm.
And it was actually when I was 26 years old that I, with a mutual friend, decided to start my first business. Um, which, to the dismay of my mother, walking away from a nice job with a great benefits and salary to basically become an entrepreneur, where I put all my savings and maxed out my credit cards to try to reach for something, a aspirational dream. That was a very frightening moment, not just for my family, but also for me, taking that dive into entrepreneurship. But really, what prompted that was, I think, this high conviction that my co-founder and I had, that we identified a gap within the market and that we can provide a solution that delivers value to our intended end customers. The story and the pitch was very elegant, and
Mhm.
early stage investors and VCs enjoyed hearing it. But ultimately, two people under the age of 30 selling to large financial institutions. We were effectively a fintech company before fintech was even a term,
Right.
um, or a mainstream term, I should say.
Mhm.
We ended up folding up the business about a year and a half later. And so it was one of the most stressful times of my career, but also one of the most formative, because I went from a hyper structured environment in consulting to essentially a free form, free fall that is entrepreneurship, where you have the luxuries of a big company, for instance, like HR,
Yeah.
travel to expenses, a clear cut pathway for advancement, to running a company where I was effectively seven different departments at once, and I was trying to create structure in a structureless environment.
So, what was the lead up to that decision to make that leap from a
It, it,
hyper-structured environment to?
it's a good question. I mean, the process of creation was very organic, I'll say. In that my co-founder came from industry, I had a tech background, and I had a business strategy background
Mhm.
from my short time at IBM, about 3.5 years. And we had spent a lot of time interviewing and executives at financial institutions, um, to basically refine what we saw was an opportunity to solve a problem in the regulatory and compliance space, as basically how information on your phone, particularly mobile, was accessed, um, and really the compliance around it, creating effectively a framework that sat on top of a mobile banking app through an SDK that prompted a user to update their credentials so that they could be compliant with the login. It was a very simple idea, but one that basically had a very large problem on a macro level that banks were scrambling with from a technology standpoint to solve. And so that process in total was about a 7 to 8 month process of just research, interviews, defining requirements for what an MVP looked like,
Right.
working to build that initial like V 0.1, like
Right. Yeah.
a very basic product, mock-ups, etc., and then using that to validate within the network. It was only once at that time when we had a critical mass of validation, from, I think it's somewhere like 15 or 20 conversations with operators at banks and people working in banks, that we decided that this was something that we deemed venture backable, I should say. And then we decided to
Mhm.
go out to the market and try to fundraise. And at that time period, I should say, the seed environment was much different than it is today. There was only a handful of firms, especially on the East Coast, that were backing this type of technology.
Mhm.
And so a lot of it was leveraging our network, our connection, cold outreach, um, to people who we knew that were other founders or in the technology space, just to get intros to their investors.
But before that, what led to that itch? That How did you go from management consulting to being a management consultant to having that entrepreneurial itch, attending tech meetups?
I, I, I think it really started from just the curiosity, like through my initially my friend group, who Some of my
Mm-hmm.
friends were working in technology at the time. Um, and then from there, it was very organic in terms of that process, like reading, like, at that point, I was deeply influenced by like Paul Graham, his
Mm-hmm.
blogs, the early YC batches that were coming
Yep.
through.
Hacker News.
This
Yeah.
this this was this was before YC was the institution that it is today.
Right.
Techstars, had just come out really around that time. I believe it was like, um, and so I think there was something like, at least from my perspective, genuinely inspiring. Um, and also at the same time, as we went through the process of creation and validation, there was like an exhilarating rush when we could identify a pain point and then theoretically apply what we saw was a solution through technology to that pain point. And so it was a progressive process, I'll say,
Mm-hmm.
but one that I had just like organically grown into through a combination of my social network and my personal research interests that led me to that point.
So, so you start your own business, and then
The
what?
business flopped. We couldn't
Right.
we couldn't commercialize it, and so um,
So,
it
talk to
was a
me.
very difficult experience, I'll say,
Yeah.
um, going through that. But it's almost cliche to say right now, but folding up a business at that time and going through that setback, I think it was one of the most defining moments of my career, where I had to reassess what I wanted to do, realign on my personal priorities, but also my career aspirations. But it was also at the same time, despite the pain and the setback, it was also very formative because it was through that setback that I actually got, introduced to a company that I ended up going to called Yext here in New York City, where I ended up spending 6 years leading the corporate strategy team over there, from some of the early stages through IPO. And it was, there's a direct line that I could point to from holding up my first company,
Mm-hmm.
kind of taking time at that point. I remember it was like a couple of weeks where I just decided to like not do anything. And then there's an inflection where I said, okay, now time to get back and really focus on my next step. And I had built all these connections through the tech world, or the early stage environment, the investor environment at that time,
Mm-hmm.
as well as leverage some of my college network, where a couple of people happened to be working at Yext, and kind of triangulated um, into that company. But the process of getting there actually had me identifying through my network at least 5 or 6 different companies, setting up meetings through investor introductions, people
Mm-hmm.
that I knew from my immediate network, social network, college network, etc., who were at these companies. Um, and ultimately, Yext was the one that I happened to be most interested in, and I resonated really well with the management team and the founders, who deeply inspired me still to this day.
Did you already know the founders at the time,
I did
or
not. I did not. And
have
so,
yeah.
I mean, again, this came from a period of setback, but I had effectively made the decision that I'm like, I was in management consulting, kind of a technology adjacent in a technology consulting position, but I wanted to go work for a software company, to gain that experience, particularly on the early stage. I had a distinct realization when I wanted to do that. Um, and one of the things I learned from the process of building a company is the power of cold outreach.
Mm-hmm.
Because effectively, if you, I think with many decisions in life, not just cold outreach, if you rationalize it and you visualize the worst possible thing that could happen or the best possible thing that can happen, effectively the worst possible thing that can happen with cold outreach is you don't really get a response. The best
Right.
possible thing is you make a connection and you go from there. And I think it was that realization that I had when I was cold emailing VCs at the time when I was raising my first round of capital, for my company, that I applied that same rigor and same thought process, thought exercise,
Mm-hmm.
um, to reaching out to my network. And so I had investors who had backed my first company, who I reached out to, who put me in contact with companies that they had invested in. There were the later stage. I had friends, that I went to college with from my network who I reached out to via email, text, LinkedIn at the time, um, who I then got connected with, and they put me in their processes from a recruiting standpoint. And ultimately, it was narrowing that down to a couple companies I was particularly interested in. And Yext ended up being the one that I chose.
So what was there some sort of positive experience that came out of cold outreach that
Yeah,
convinced you that this was the mental model to follow?
I think speaking from experience, there's like an inherent barrier I think that some people or you might have when thinking
Mhm.
about this because you don't want to waste someone's time, you don't want to bother them.
Right.
But once you get over that hump, I think also part of it is rationalizing that like if you reach out to someone and they don't respond, it's not like they're going to hold a vendetta against you. They're going to continue living their life. Their perspective,
Right.
any one individual's perspective is the arc is very narrow because it's mostly relegated to the individual and those around immediately around the individual. So, for instance, if you cold emailed me, Jason, like I wouldn't, for some reason, perhaps have a grudge against you, or not respond or go out of my way
Right.
even to like sabotage you. I might just leave it hanging or ghost you or not respond because
Mhm.
I'm busy and going about my life, just like you're busy going about your life. And I think that again, that mental exercise of understanding that point helped me rationalize a process or help me conceptualize a process to reach out cold. Um, and I would say like for probably every 5 people I reached out to, maybe one responded.
Mhm.
Um, but the responses that I had greatly benefited my situation and also helped further extend and build my network. And what I also found too is that for the most part, for those people who did respond, the vast majority of them were happy to help because they had some sort of shared connection. Either I was getting intro to someone that knew me well, or they maybe were alumni of the college I went to, or we had worked together at IBM and like, we had that shared connection. But um, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for honestly those individuals taking some time out of their day um, to extend maybe an intro or to help any way that I can. And I think a lot of that kind of has imprinted on my operating philosophy, especially in the job that I'm in VC, um, where I get reached out to quite frequently. Um, but at the same time, like, like I can empathize with those people who are reaching out, and
Mhm.
sometimes even just one fruitful connection can change the entire trajectory of someone's search or someone's journey that they're on.
So that was part one of my interview with Stephan Cizmar, an early stage investor and tech veteran. Click here for part two.